All right, guys, welcome back to Wide Awake News Radio. I'm Charlie McGrath, your host. It's the 6th day of May, Monday. I want to thank Gary Hindershot for providing us with the Alternative Energy Hour every Monday, 5 o'clock West, 8 o'clock East. You can certainly catch more of Gary's work by just searching for Smart Scarecrow Program. He has his own program, 2 hours at least every Thursday night that he hosts from Justin TV. All right, if you're not one of the 50 or so we have in the chat right now, and you have questions for the most authoritative military man that I've ever interviewed, and I say this with all assurances that I mean this from the bottom of my heart, one of the greatest military leaders that we've had in our country in a long, long time. Get into the chat room, wideawakenews.com, click on the Wide Awake radio microphone. You can put your questions into chat. I'm not going to take any phone calls because I've got a lot of things that I want to go over with Colonel Mcgregor, but I will monitor the chat, and Gary monitors the chat. If you have questions, put them in there, and we'll do our best to answer them. Colonel Mcgregor is I'm not even going to do my warm-up. I have a video that I put out tonight, but I'm not even going to do a monologue because we've got 43 minutes of talk time, and I need to pick this man's brain because I am absolutely convinced that we are being set up for a massive change on this planet, politically, geopolitically, domestically. And Colonel McGregor's experience is not only bold and revolutionary in his thinking, this has caused him to be sought out by top military officials at the Pentagon, as well as his peers when he was in the service. It's also led his outright demand for the truth and logic has not only cost him a lot of caused him a lot of praise. It's also given him a little bit of heartache in his military career because he's not afraid to tell the truth. Colonel Mcgregor is also my former boss when I was in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment stationed out in Nuremberg, Germany. Colonel McGregor, excuse me, was essential in engineering the Battle of 73 Easting, a massive victory for U.S. forces. And this is lost in history sometimes, but it was a 23-minute battle, 10 tanks, 13 Bradley fighting vehicles, and it took on, excuse me, over 70 armored Iraqi vehicles, and these were not throwaway munitions that Iraqis had. The point I'm trying to make with this story is Colonel McGregor saved lives with his tactical brilliance. Tonight, I'm going to ask him where we're at as a nation, and you need to listen to what the man has to say. I don't know if I'm going to agree with him 100%, but I'm going to divert to, and I'm going to concede to his brilliance in these matters. Colonel McGregor, you heard that warm-up. I'm not trying to blow smoke up your very starched military skirt. I do respect everything that you've done in your career, especially your bold nature. And I'm concerned, Colonel. I have a 13-year-old son. My son was born 1 year prior to 9/11. His father, me, served in the Gulf War in Iraq. We are still in this region of the world. We still have a government that is looking outside of the confines of the Constitution and the notion of what war is all about. I am literally concerned for the safety of my child, that he's going to be fighting in the same region of the world, or asked to fight in the same region of the world that we fought in so many years ago. No end in sight in destabilization. Welcome to the program, and I apologize for that hard-hitting question. Are we heading for never-ending war in the Middle East and North Africa?
Well, Charlie, first let me tell you that I had to pinch myself and make sure I was alive after having been eulogized with those glowing words.
Well, thanks, I mean every word of it. Colonel, I mean, you know what? I do this 5 nights a week, 2 hours, sometimes 2 hours a night. I interview a lot of people, but you truly do have my respect. And my, the following of Wide Awake News Radio, there is a lot of people who are anti-war. I'm one of them. Mm-hmm. But there's certainly a difference between anti-war and anti-military. I have a lot of respect for our military. I have a lot of compassion, and I have a lot of anger at what's happening to our men and women today. They're being broken and sent home under false pretenses. And I know nobody understands this better than you, because you have commanded men and you have saved lives, and I mean that. People need to understand that.
Well,
So,
Charlie, look, let's keep something in mind that until very recently, I think Americans in general have lost their fear of war.
Yeah.
I don't think they really understand what war is all about. For most Americans over the last 20-plus years, war is something that happens in someone else's country, on someone else's soil. And as a result, as long as prosperity was good, people were making lots of money and comfortable, a small number of people in Washington were free to do essentially whatever they wanted to do with the armed forces.
Yeah.
I think that's ended. And if you look at the most recent polling data, there's overwhelming opposition to any plan to intervene in Syria right now. And I mean overwhelming. Only 25% of those polled in the most recent polls that I've seen indicated that they would support intervention in Syria. So I think we've reached a point in the history of the American people where we are back to where historically we have been. If you go back and look at the American people, certainly since we began looking at polls over the last 150 years, Americans were disinclined for very good reasons to involve themselves in other people's wars and problems.
Yeah.
That changed briefly with the Spanish-American War, but our experience in the Philippines was so negative that by 1910, Teddy Roosevelt said, look, this is something we shouldn't have done. We don't want to do it again. Woodrow Wilson dragged us kicking and screaming into the First World War. And our experience during that war was so terrible that once it ended and the troops came home, you got essentially 12 years of conservative Republican government that was only interrupted by the Depression. And that was a game changer that brought the left to power, and it created an enormously powerful government. It established us ultimately as the preeminent military power in the world by the end of the Second World War. And as a result, we became interested, at least we thought we were, in what was happening around the world. And all of our interventions, beginning with Vietnam and up until the present, have not been very rewarding strategically for us. And if anything, they've been bankrupting. So I think we've reached a point, a strategic inflection point, if you will, where things are, in fact, changing. And I don't, for one, think that we will intervene in Syria, despite the enormous pressure that's being brought to bear on the government and on the American people by the media, the mainstream media, let us say, and certain individuals who are well-funded and well-financed in the House and the Senate. Don't think it's going to happen.
I certainly hope you're correct, and I agree with your assessment 100%. We've been desensitized to what is going on, and most egregiously, we're desensitized to the fact that we are losing more of our servicemen due to suicide than we are combat fatalities now. In fact, as a nation, suicide has replaced the car accidents as a leading cause of death. And the desensitization, a desensitized nation is a very dangerous nation, and I think that it's bore out over the last decade. As far as Syria goes, the simple fact of the matter is, this is of course my opinion and mine only. We are backing. We the people. You listening to our voices tonight. We are backing the exact same element that we were convinced or sold a lie to about, that are terrorists that we were shooting at and shooting at us inside of Iraq and Afghanistan. These are the exact same individuals that were involved in overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi inside of Libya under a U.S. and NATO-backed no-fly zone.
Remember, Charlie, that a lot of people in Washington who've literally gotten away with murder over the last 20-plus years live in what I would call the continuous present. There is no past. There is only the present. And whatever happened in the past is irrelevant to what we will do in the future. So regardless of the mistakes that we've made in the past, there's no reason not to continue to make new mistakes in the future. and the argument from people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham and others.
Oh yeah, Colonel, let me interrupt you, because we got a break here, and I definitely want to pick on McCain and Graham when we come back. We'll be back with Colonel Douglas Mcgregor and more Wide Awake News Radio. Just a minute, hang tight. All right, welcome back to Wide Awake News Radio. Colonel Douglas Mcgregor is our guest, and we were talking during the break about a place him and I have both been, which is Nuremberg, Germany. I was stationed there, and we were talking about the barracks that used to be there and how it's gone, and how the guilt that is being dumped onto the people, in this case of Germany, has led to the destruction of their history. And I asked, is this something that is happening here? We want to forget about history so we can be doomed to repeat mistakes. I want to get into that topic, but I want you to finish your thought on warmongering officials that have no problem spilling blood of the people of our nation as well as people of the world for the name of what? I don't know. I guess spreading democracy, purple finger revolution, anything and everything but the truth. Colonel Mcgregor, you were talking.
Well, Charlie, we've created a generation of people, of which McCain and Lindsey Graham are part. And, of course, the neocons, which are an extension of that, people like Wolfowitz and Faith Libby and others who became, infamous as a result of the Bush era. And certainly former Vice President Cheney and others convinced themselves and then set out to convince the American people that unless we are engaged everywhere all the time, that the world we know will be in jeopardy, that everything will fall apart, and that we'll end up with some sort of strange conglomerate of terrorists and maniacs on our doorstep trying to kill us.
Right.
This is, of course, a gross exaggeration. It stems from a false analogy, and the false analogy was, and still is, unfortunately, that we are living in an era similar to the 1930s and the run-up to the Second World War, and that's absolutely untrue. We're living in a period that if you want to go back and look at an historical era that compares with today's global situation, it looks a lot more like the late 19th century, about 1900, maybe a little earlier, except that we're in very difficult economic circumstances, not simply here in the United States, but around the world. And one of the things that you asked earlier is what's really ailing the United States? What is our biggest challenge right now? It's not overseas, and that's what most Americans understand. They understand that restoring our prosperity, regaining economic strength is the top priority. And fortunately right now, there are more and more people in Washington coming around to that understanding. I think the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Hagel, understands that. I think Mr. Kerry and the State Department understand it. The problem is how to do it, and that's the real rub. What we've got on one side of the argument are the people that historically are on the left. These are the Keynesians who believe that you can simply restart the economic engine by flooding the country, the banking system, with cash, cheap money. And that, of course, is contributing to the bubble that you see in the stock market, and it's propping up the real estate market. The fear is when you don't produce cheap money, you don't push the button and essentially print trillions of dollars, that everything will come to a halt and that the damage will be very serious. Well, they're not entirely wrong. That's going to happen. We don't know when it will happen, but at some point we won't be able to control interest rates. The bond market will race out of control. It will collapse. We won't be able to borrow as we would like. When that occurs, we'll be in a very serious crisis, and economic prosperity in the United States will tank. That's not the end of this, but it will put us into a depression-like environment. And some people would tell you, and I'm sure you've heard this from other guests on your program, that in many areas of the country we're already in a depression.
No
it's
doubt.
just that nobody cares to admit it, no one wants to address it, and we keep focused on this ridiculous thing called the stock market, where the volume is extremely low because very, very few people are involved anymore in the market. It's now institutional. More than anything else, and very wealthy and well-financed interests, but the average American has largely walked away from it. And what's happening there is divorced from the reality that we're talking about nationwide.
Colonel, I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I've come on here many times and said that you need to view the Dow Jones, the S&P, the NASDAQ as counterintuitive to the health of our economy. Whatever, it isn't the days where it's 14,000 on the Dow. It means we have a vibrant economy looking forward to the future. It's exactly the opposite of that.
Yes.
We have $84 billion a month being laundered by the Federal Reserve, buying fraudulent failure in a lot of cases. This is, black box trading, high frequency trading. This is what's keeping this indicator alive. That and the modern day breadline of 50 million people on food stamps and countless other social safety nets are keeping the illusion of sustained recovery. But in reality, this is a control mechanism in an effect that if the will of the people is not in line with the status quo of deviant Washington politicians, they have this control mechanism that is 150 plus million Americans receiving some sort of check in one form or another from this same, freedom-loving, air quote, government.
Yeah, but of course this control is an illusion because what you're describing is an artificial construct that cannot survive. It's not going to last. It can't endure. We are going to face a situation where printing the money will not be possible. Some would say we've already destroyed the value of our currency. But all of these things contribute to the reduction in federal spending that's absolutely vital. That has to happen. Colonel, that's why we're starting with defense.
Yeah, and let's pick it up. I apologize. I get lost in the conversation with you, and the second break snuck up on me. We'll have a longer segment on the backside of this 3-minute break. Hang tight for Colonel Douglas Mcgregor and Wide Awake News Radio. We'll be right back. All right, back with Colonel Douglas Mcgregor on Wide Awake News Radio. I'm going to jump right into it because he brought up a key point. And guys, I know we're going everywhere, but I'm letting the Colonel, run the direction he wants to because I opened the program saying I'm afraid, and I'm not. This isn't BS. This is truth. I am afraid for my 13-year-old son. He's 5 years away from being military age, and at this point in time, I would encourage him wholeheartedly to think long and hard, and if he accepted my wisdom, he would not be going into a conflict with no end and no reason that I can get behind. Colonel, defense spending, we're spending black budget, whatever you want to call it. Some are saying $1 trillion a year. Some are saying more. We have bases all around this world. We spend more than the other 26 nations combined on air quote defense spending, and 25 of them happen to be our allies. It is breaking our nation. Our economy is in tatters, and we do not have the money for this forced protection or projection rather. And a lot of people, myself included, believe it is not in a moral imperative that we do what we're doing. Give me the economic benefits of a sane, constitutional Department of Defense and military spending, please.
Well, the first point to keep in mind, and this is something that you mentioned earlier, is that the world has changed. This is not 1955, 65, 75, or 85. We live in a world that is largely recovered from the devastation of the Second World War. And we are now one of many major powers with various interests. Everyone in the world is largely focused on the same thing, and that is economic growth, economic prosperity. That's where we should be focused as well. Our number one priority should be to trade and do business with the rest of the world. We don't live in an ideologically defined environment anymore. There are no good and bad powers. So this notion that everything is black and white is infantile and ridiculous. So the first thing that we have to do is see that our role in the world is different now. We don't have to be everywhere, and if we pull out, if we leave, and we are ultimately going to do that to save money, the world is not going to collapse, and nations are not going to immediately go to war with each other. Now, in certain areas of the world, the Middle East is a good example, Central Africa is another, people there have been killing each other for centuries. Our presence or absence isn't going to make a great deal of difference to that. And we are going to see more wars in those areas, and probably to some extent also in Central Asia. We're going to see some nations collapse. China is in very serious economic trouble. And as we discussed during the break, they are turning to the same mechanism of central planning and money production, cheap money, that we are to try and stave off the inevitable, which is you have to come to terms with debt and you have to be productive. it won't work. And China has been through these bust and boom cycles over the last 1,000 years several times. So China is very rapidly approaching its point of no return in terms of growth and expansion. It's going to contract. Whether or not it survives as a unitary state is a real question. And here at home, we face a very similar set of circumstances, except that here in the United States, we have millions of people who, as you point out, have become dependent on the federal government for survival. We're not talking about a simple Social Security check. We're talking about access to free health care, free services, free education, free everything that you can think of that has become commonplace. And the upper and middle classes of the United States have been subsidizing and financing millions and millions of people in this growing underclass. This, of course, is one of the issues that's come up with illegal immigration. We simply can't afford it. We can't afford to have millions and millions and millions of people who suddenly overnight become citizens and then begin to make demands on the federal government in terms of free services, particularly when you're talking about tens of millions of people who are unskilled, uneducated, and simply are not going to contribute to the capital growth of the United States.
Colonel,
so all of these issues are going to take, center stage.
Right.
Defense needs to scale back. In other words, we need to become very interested in what I would call hemispheric defense of the Western Hemisphere and the United States, first and foremost, our coastal waters, our borders, our airspace. Then we need to be interested in access. There are key points around the world, places that we need access to for raw materials in order to do business, in order to export things that we produce, export food. While at the same time here at home, we focus primarily in three sectors. Energy, where we can become, within the next 10 years, the number one energy producer in the entire world and totally self-sufficient while we also export. Secondly, agriculture. We've allowed agriculture to really decline as a critical component of our economy, and we are in a position to feed the world. So we have to reinvigorate agriculture. And then finally, high-tech manufacturing. Not rubber dinosaurs, not necessarily trucks and automobiles that we've seen that are, old technology, but high-tech manufacturing, the things that we can do better than anyone else with a strong, skilled labor pool of Americans. Those are the things that we need to focus on. In order to do that, we do have to shift resources into the private sector. That means you stop taking resources out of the private sector. That means that you spend less on defense, but you can also spend more prudently. I mean, very few people realize that during the Second World War, when we had 11 million men in the United States Army and the United States Army Air Corps, in other words, the Air Force and the Army combined, we had 4 four-star generals. Today, for a combined force, Army and Air Force of roughly 880,000, we have over 24 four-star generals. This is the sort of corruption that is set into the system, this bureaucratic bloat, this staggering overhead, while at the same time the people that actually do something, the people that deploy and fight, the people that are actually under fire, those numbers have fallen precipitously. So when you read the newspaper, every day you read about another 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 soldiers or Marines who are being expelled from the armed forces, essentially sent onto the street. You notice that never, ever is there the elimination of a single 3- or 4-star general or headquarters. Those things continue to remain intact because that's really what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with this staggering bureaucracy that exists first and foremost to feed itself, to support itself and sustain itself. It's not necessarily there to defend us in the sense that we think of it historically.
Colonel, I couldn't agree with you more, and I guess with a minute before this last break, it sounds like the platform for Colonel Mcgregor in 2016, right? And this is the kind of thing that I absolutely love to hear, which is a true private sector. I'm not talking about Wall Street private sector. I'm talking a true private industry, private sector growth, real middle-class jobs, quit exporting our talent, quit exporting our capacity around the world, real technology, not just military technology that's being used to spy on the world and soon to be spying on us, My question that I would pose to you, and go ahead and start answering it, and then we'll cut you off for the break, is what is the stumbling block? Is it this juggernaut that is this out-of-control bureaucracy that has to be stopped, and how do we do that?
Well, the first thing you have to do is stop the money train, and that's going to happen. I would urge your listeners, if they have the opportunity, to go online and look at the kinds of things that people like Peter Schiff in San Francisco or Kyle Bass in Texas, these are hedge fund managers, the kinds of things that they have said, or Michael Faber, a German hedge fund manager who's also made billions of dollars, who currently lives, I think, in Singapore, or he may be in the Philippines. These people take a very different view of the economy from the banks. Think of the banks as people who are interested primarily along the lines of the generals at the top of the Pentagon bureaucracy. They want to sustain themselves where they are. They like the status quo. The status quo feeds them and enriches them, but it hurts the American people. Listen to the hedge fund managers. They will tell you the grim truth, and the point is, the debt is beyond payment. We can't settle it. We'll end up having to restructure it. But we're not going to even address that until we, quote-unquote, default. And the way you default is that you can no longer borrow because the interest rates you can no longer control make the payment on the existing debt unsustainable. Those are the things that are going to put an end to the various evils that you're discussing and are going to compel us to make profound change in the American military establishment, the defense establishment, and our national strategy, not just military, but more broadly, economic strategy as well. But it's not going to happen until the money runs out, and that's the bad news.
That is
People
the bad
don't
news.
change behavior until they're forced to.
Another person that is saying now on this program that financial collapse, and in some respect, political and civil, is not the end of the world. And in fact, it could be the beginning of a renaissance in the United States of America. We're going to continue this conversation right through to the end of the hour. So let's keep it going. I look at the headlines today, and I sent you a few of them before the program. The video I did tonight had everything to do with nullification, states' rights, sovereignty, that on that line. We're talking. You're painting a case for why the status quo is so entrenched. A 1 million-man army and scores of 4-star generals, a bureaucracy that feeds amongst itself, and its number one goal is to protect that status quo, to protect that power structure at all costs. We have military projection around the world, yet we see this technology starting to turn inward. We see reports coming out from the Department of Homeland Security, which is something, in my opinion, reminiscent of the fatherland in pre-World War II Germany. We see this control apparatus, the security industrial complex, starting to focus inward. Colonel, in your opinion, and get into as depth as you choose to, is there a second American Revolution or a second Civil War? Is there a breakup potential of this? Nothing lasts forever. 200 plus years of the United States of America is not world history. You eloquently pointed out China over 1,000 years is one regime to another. Is the potential there for an onerous, tyrannical government that the president's working really hard telling students recently not to listen to people that are naysayers and talk about tyrannical government? Is the potential there, real world, for an event like this in the United States on the backside of a collapse or because of government's action to prevent collapse or sustain or to quell any uprising that could come out of a financial collapse?
Well, there was a gentleman named Crane Britton who wrote a book that was published, I think, in 1939, and it was called Anatomy of Revolution. And he looked at the French Revolution of 1789. He looked at the English Revolution that came at the time of Cromwell that resulted in the removal of the king and the creation of a republic, which was then subsequently transformed into parliamentary dominance, but with the restoration of the monarchy. He also looked at the Russian Revolution, trying to understand what had actually happened there. how people came to power. I think that each of these is different. It depends on the national culture, the sense of national identity, the distribution of economic influence and money, frankly. All of these things have a role to play, and the level of discontent, and then people emerge that you've never heard of before, people like Cromwell or Robespierre or others, who have the courage to stand up and tell the truth, and then ultimately to lead. I think that we could certainly experience conditions in the future over the next 3 to 5 years that might resemble the period certainly leading up to 1789 in France. Because if you look at the economic conditions in France, the French had squandered a huge portion of their treasury in pointless wars against Great Britain and other European powers, and then more recently, of course, on the American Revolution, in an effort once again to undermine British control of North America. In addition to that, very bad economic policies, central planning, in the worst sense of the word, that caused the engine of government to simply seize up and eventually fail. In the meantime, the people at the top got shamelessly wealthy, and the people in the middle class, got very poor. And that was really the critical development, because these revolutions, if they have anything in common, it's that the middle class is decisive. It rises up because it's unhappy with the degree to which it's being impoverished by an incompetent government, mismanaged and misruled. So I think, there's the potential for that, particularly if you get the kind of collapse that we're talking about. And no one can predict exactly when, under what circumstances, the kind of thing we're talking about could happen in the United States. But one thing is absolutely certain: the crushing impact of the debt is deadly. When it will strike, no one knows, but it inevitably will strike. Debt has always mattered over the last 5,000 years of human history. The notion that debt doesn't matter, that you can simply print money without consequences, that you can subsidize industries that are unproductive, that you can redistribute income that you do not create in the private sector but create push-button-wise in order to pacify masses of people that can't sustain themselves. Those kinds of things don't last. I just don't know when it will happen, but when it does, the American people, and by that I'm talking about the broad base American population that we call the middle class, is going to demand action. And if they don't get action, they will insist on it. So you will either get it through the ballot box or you will get it otherwise, but it will definitely happen.
I guess the question I'd ask is it ultimate hubris to that these power elite that we spent talking about for the last 40 minutes that want to gain and hold this power and control, did they believe that this nation is a eastern seaboard and a western coast, and that there's a whole this whole empty space in the middle? Did they believe they can control this from on high through legislation and the use of technology? Are they wargaming, and this would be my specific question, with the shocking stockpile, the shocking build-out of security that seems to be looking inward? Are they wargaming this? And the reason I'm asking you this question, and the reason I need everybody watching this later on YouTube or listening on Rents right now to listen to what the Colonel has to say, this is somebody that then Secretary of Defense in 2001 forced General Tommy Franks, to listen to before we went in for a lightning. If the war would have been for weapons of mass destruction, like we've been told, we'd have been out of Iraq in short order, thanks to Colonel Mcgregor. He understands wargaming. He understands how the looking for potential crisis in the future is done at the government level. I just get this sense, this foreboding sense that they understand what is coming. And you're right, it's going to be because of a financial crisis that is going to lead to basically, in layman's term, a lot of pissed off people in this country, and a lot of them are going to be in the middle of this country. Do you think they're taking measures now to combat this uprising?
Well, that's extremely difficult to say, because first of all, most of the people that are in the security forces that you're describing are people like you and me.
Yeah.
These people are not the enemies of the American people. They're as American as you and I are. They believe strongly in individual rights and in upholding the law.
Okay.
So I have great confidence in the police forces and in the armed forces. I don't see them as being problematic at all. And I think if there were an attempt to employ them along the lines that you were suggesting, that there would be tremendous resistance. So I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is something that you mentioned at the beginning. You talked about the coasts. It's not just the coasts. It's essentially these large urban areas where you have concentrations of people who in many cases are not even Americans. In some cases, they feel completely divorced from society. They feel entitled. And when the food stamps stop, when the free services end, when the heating bills aren't paid and the heating doesn't come through, in many of these large cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Washington, Baltimore, St. Louis, Detroit, New Orleans, San Francisco, Los Angeles, this underclass that resides in these places, I think, could become very violent. The question then is what will be done? Will we do what we did in 1968, 69, 70, and 71 and simply stand by and watch and feel sympathy for the people that are destroying neighborhoods, private property, and committing crimes and harming people? Or will we say that's unacceptable and we won't tolerate it? That's the real question. And what does your government do? Is it paralyzed or does it act to protect private property, American citizens, and restore order? I don't know when that will happen, but the kind of economic crisis that we're describing, which I think is unavoidable, is going to precipitate that.
Yeah.
And I would look at that first because, frankly, the people you're describing that do not live in the areas that I just mentioned, who live in the rest of the country, they obey the law.
Yeah.
They are the least likely to stand up and violate the law.
Here's the danger I worry about, Colonel. You're right. I have an AR-15 that's 5 feet away from me. I'm a law-abiding American, and I will defend that right for anybody unto death. I am worried about the actions that we've seen throughout history. We talked about Germany a few times. There was a populace that, through economic collapse, through depression, was very malleable, and a lot of blame was placed on a lot of the same things we're talking about: an influx of immigrants, an influx and a destruction of an economy due to reckless government spending. And a nation of middle class, a nation was convinced the course of action was, now history has shown, to be something that was tremendously devastating to Europe. It put it in the second war on that continent in less than 50 years.
Yeah, but I think that's a false analogy.
Okay.
And for people that lived through the 30s in that environment, quite frankly, they didn't necessarily agree with everything that was done, but the restoration of prosperity was dramatic. And the victories in the West until the decision to invade the Soviet Union were seen as justified, particularly given what had happened in the First World War. We're not dealing with those kinds of conditions here in the United States. We're a very different situation. That's why I tend to go back to 1789 and look at France, that until 1789, much like the United States, was the wealthiest power in the world. It had the highest standard of living. It was the largest and most dynamic military power in Europe. That's more like us. And the middle class was impoverished as a result of these bad policies, foreign policies as well as domestic policies, and this relentless determination to centralize control inside the country in Paris, to the point where there was no initiative anywhere else, where decisions couldn't be made anywhere else. We've already begun rebelling against that. Now, for many people in Washington, someone who stands up and says there are 78 million legal gun owners and not a single one committed a crime yesterday, anyone who says that inside the Beltway is regarded as an ignoramus. as a fool who is not educated, who is not enlightened. Anyone who suggests that you ought to be able to keep most of the money that you make, that you earn with your own sweat or intelligence, is viewed as someone who's ignorant and just doesn't understand the criticality of redistributing income from those who make it to those who don't. These are fundamental issues that are going to be at the center of the fight. But the point that you're concerned about, the use of surveillance against that broad-based population, I think is grossly exaggerated. I don't see that happening because I have faith and confidence in the Americans who are in the security services, in the intelligence community, and in the armed forces. I know them, and I know that many of them feel no differently from you or I, and are just as concerned about these things, and they will not act against the American people. That doesn't mean it won't be tried, surely, but remember that most of the people that are responsible for the developments that we're seeing are really very much on the left. You know, the left has won all of the arguments since 1965. The right has been on the losing side. Some people would argue that we've been on the losing side since the Depression, that the process of stimulating growth and economic development through these bubbles, through cheap money and so forth, has won over many, many people. Many of the people that today we call Republicans wouldn't qualify as Republicans 25 or 30 years ago.
No doubt about that.
So that's an issue. Those people have won all of the arguments, but what happens when everything collapses?
Yeah.
And I'm talking about the financial implosion that is unavoidable. You cannot conceal the truth forever. It won't work. You're either producing and exporting or you're not. You're either employing people productively or you're not. We know it's not happening. We know the real unemployment figures are dramatically higher than what the government admits. We know the government wants to recalculate gross domestic product. It's another shell game. Who are we kidding?
Well, Colonel, we got the final music wrap up here playing in my ear, and I'm gonna agree with you that on this point, without a doubt, this canard, this game, is run its course. And I don't know if it's 5 years, I don't know if it's 10 years, I don't know if it's 5 minutes, but the economic reality of the condition we're in will be known, and the outcome is not. I mean, I think a lot of people are going to see a change in lifestyle that they're going to be waylaid by because they're not paying attention, and they have been desensitized to what war looks like and what real turmoil looks like. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, I could talk to you for the entire evening. I greatly appreciate your time, your service, and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. Thank you very much, and we'll try to get you on again the program real soon.
Hey, thanks for thinking of me.
You betcha. Thank you, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Guys, please stay tuned for Jeff Renz because he is coming up next. Have a good night. We will have this full interview up on YouTube here in the next couple hours, and if you missed part of it, you can rewatch it there. I want to thank Brett for helping us out with that last segment as well. Enjoy Jeff Renz. He's coming up next. Have a good night. Peace.